It featured our CEO, Joanne Jenkins, and our Senior Vice President for Global Thought Leadership, Jean Axios, in addition to the President of the UN General Assembly and several private sector leaders. Even as COVID-19 struck us last year, AARP continued to work with the UN partners to promote the outstanding UN policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on older persons. In fact, Secretary General Gutierrez sat down with Joanne Jenkins to discuss this important guidance, and their conversation was translated into 6 languages and seen by tens of thousands of people around the world. Finally, in late September, in recognition of International Day of the Older Persons, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, had a fireside chat with the AARP's Chief Public Policy Officer, Deborah Whitman, to discuss the significant impact that COVID-19 was having on the rights of older persons, which is an issue that remains a core focus of ours today. We look to build on that record of success and collaboration this year, starting today, as we help to kick off the 59th session of the Commission for Social Development, which has a timely focus on the role of digital technologies on the social development and well-being of all. I'll come back to this important theme in a moment, but I wanted to briefly pause to recognize and thank all of our partners in this endeavor. First and foremost, Amal Abu-Rafe, who is Chief of the Program on Aging, has been a friend and partner on this and on so many other things. We are very grateful for her. In addition, Ursula Weinhoven of the ITU and Barbara Zamorska of the UN Special Procedures Office of the Independent Expert have been great collaborators. At AARP, we are looking forward to working more closely with Claudia Mailer, the independent expert of the human rights of older people, in the months and years ahead. In addition, we are very grateful to Raj Kumar of DevEx and all the outstanding panelists and speakers who will follow. And finally, in addition to Erica Dar, I'd like to recognize my colleagues, Holly Schultz and Michael Epstein, who did a lot of work behind the scenes to help make this event happen. Thank you all. Now, returning to our theme, I wanted to say a few words about why we are here discussing these issues before turning it over to our subject matter experts. To provide a little recent history, in July 2018, the Secretary General convened a high-level panel to consider the question of digital cooperation, the ways we work together to address the social, ethical, legal, and economic impact of digital technologies, and to consider how digital cooperation could contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. The high-level panel was co-chaired by Melinda Gates and Jack Ma, and it was informed by a series of roundtables that included a truly impressive array of experts: civil society, government, academia, the technical community, and the private sector. The deliberations of the roundtable are online on the UN website, and I highly recommend them to anyone working on these issues. After receiving the recommendations of the high-level panel, the Secretary General released his report, The Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, last June. The roadmap identified 8 important areas for action, including such things as achieving universal connectivity by 2030, promoting digital public goods to promote a more equitable world, and ensuring the protection of human rights in the digital era, among others. But of the 8, one in particular stands out for AARP today: ensuring the digital inclusion for all, including the most vulnerable. It is worth noting that Mexico led the roundtable on digital inclusion, and I am grateful that Ambassador Sandoval Mendiolea is here with us today. Because of the pandemic, we now recognize more than ever the essential necessity of digital technology. Access to technology isn't just about having the latest piece of hardware in your hand. In today's world, access to technology is really about access to absolutely everything else: information and education, our jobs, the purchase of goods and services, our entertainment, and perhaps most importantly, especially now, our ability to communicate and stay connected with one another. It is the vehicle through which we now live. In fact, we wouldn't be meeting right now if we didn't have access to digital technology. It is for this reason that the issue of the day touches us all. We are not about to have a wonky conversation about tech protocols and standards, but rather about the critical need for everyone to have access to the tools that touch every aspect of our lives. AARP has a long history of working to reduce disparities and promote greater equity and inclusion. We have a multi-year strategy to meaningfully reduce disparities across race and other socio-demographic factors as we work to enhance the rights and protections for older people. And this year, AARP has a new enterprise-wide strategy on digital equity, which is led by Allison Bryant, who you will hear from this morning. So we are pleased to be part of this conversation about the critical issues related to increasing access to digital technologies by older persons. we know that access is a necessary but insufficient step forward. To capture the power of digital technologies, we need to focus on the broader ecosystems that enable digital technologies to be used in an inclusive manner. We have a genuine opportunity in front of us. Just as digital divides reflect and amplify existing social, cultural, and economic inequalities, we can employ digital technology as a powerful tool to reduce disparities and increase inclusion, if we get this right. By working for greater digital access and inclusive design for older persons, we can simultaneously work to increase access for younger people, for people with disabilities, for women, and for Indigenous people, and many others, in order to foster their social inclusion and participation. And so I'm very much looking forward to this important conversation. With that, it is my pleasure to invite Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development and the Chief Economist for UN DESA, Elliot Harris, to provide opening remarks. Assistant Secretary General Harris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rutledge, for your welcoming remarks. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by thanking our co-host, the AARP, for its long-standing role in advocating with governments, businesses, and NGOs to champion the interests of older persons. We welcome you all to our 14th joint AARP-DESA Briefing Series. We're happy to co-sponsor this year's event with the Permanent Mission of Mexico, which is a champion member of the Digital Inclusion and Data Roundtable, to follow up on the report of the High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation. We also welcome the partnership with the International Telecommunications Union and with the UN International Expert on the Human Rights of Older Persons. Our meeting today is timely, coming just before the Commission for Social Development begins its 59th session. We have several busy days ahead. The COVID-19 pandemic is having a dramatic impact on social development, threatening to reverse decades of progress in the fight against poverty and exacerbating already high levels of inequality. This has compromised the well-being of too many, including older persons. This session of the Commission for Social Development provides member states with the platform to rethink existing socio-economic policy frameworks to build forward better after the pandemic, and to examine closely the key role that digital technologies can and should play. We are on the verge of a fourth industrial revolution characterized by rapid digital innovation. This will affect all sectors of the society, the way we live, work, and relate to each other. We need the right policies grounded on evidence and data from the public and private sectors to make sure that this process is inclusive of all, including older persons. We know from available evidence that older persons experience the downsides of the digital divide to a greater extent than many other groups in society. And this means that older persons often do not benefit fully from the opportunities provided by technological progress. As digital technologies become more and more ingrained in everyday life, the impact of digital exclusion will widen. This may take the form of being unable to find or retain employment because of insufficient knowledge of new digital tools, or adverse health impacts as a result of inadequate access to the platforms and technologies that healthcare providers are using more and more. It can also mean not being aware of or able to fully access essential public services which are increasingly being offered only online. Understanding how and to what extent such changes will affect older persons is a precondition for us to accelerate their integration. The dangers of gender or race-based discrimination and bias in the use of artificial intelligence have been well researched and documented. But little comparable information and analysis exists with regard to older persons. We need to know what biases against older persons already exist in artificial intelligence. We need to understand better how such biases compound the pervasive effects of age discrimination in our societies, how they exacerbate the exclusion of older people and the negative effects of the digital divide. We also need to guard against and prevent new biases that could shape a system that discriminates against older persons. To tackle these issues, older persons and their needs have to be explicitly addressed in all relevant decisions at all levels. The ethical frameworks on artificial intelligence that are being developed by companies and governments around the world must be formulated in full awareness of the challenges and opportunities that these new technologies pose for older persons, particularly when addressing issues that are of importance to older persons, such as technology for aged care. Addressing data gaps is critical. Without adequate age disaggregated data, it will be difficult for us to fully understand and therefore to address properly the digital divide. We need to integrate the considerations of age, including old age, into every effort on digital inclusion and to ensure that the data we use enable this. Finally, we need to be looking forward. There is much that we do not know about how the digital revolution will unfold, how its potential will crystallize in 2 or 3 decades. But we do know already what the world is going to look like in terms of the age distribution of the future. The world's population is growing older. Virtually every country in the world is experiencing growth in the size and share of older persons in their population. And the countries expected to witness the largest relative increase in the number of older persons are mainly in the less developed regions. By 2050, 1 in 6 people in the world will be aged 65 years or above, up from 1 in 11 in 2019. If we want a better and more inclusive future, we need to push the agenda of older persons and digital technologies even further. Ensuring that older persons are equal participants of technological progress is not simply about empowering them through new tools, but also about fully utilizing the potential and expertise of persons of all ages, including older persons, to enrich the digital world. I'm confident that this event is a stepping stone in that direction, and I look forward to the ideas that will be exchanged over the next hours. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, ASG Harris. I now call upon Claudia Mahler, the independent expert on the rights of older persons, to provide the keynote address. Over to you, Claudia.
Thank you, Erica. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, I'm truly honored to be part of this event and would like to thank the organizers, especially our colleagues at AARP, DESA, and ITU, as well as everyone else for contributing to today's highly topical and timely side event. I wish to build up on the observations by the preceding speakers and amplify the human rights dimension of the discussion. As mentioned, digital technologies and the internet have become essential tools to enjoy our rights and fulfill our needs, especially as restrictions imposed in the context of the global health pandemic have further accelerated the use of online and mobile services. Being able to take advantage of digital technologies determines who is able to stay connected, employed, educated, as well as safe and healthy. Clearly, this has significant human rights implications, and the human rights-based approach provides a useful and needed framework for the promoting and providing guarantees for digital inclusion, including with respect to access to infrastructure and development of new technologies. The mandate of the independent expert on the human rights of older persons has regularly touched on the different ways that digitalization impacts the enjoyment of human rights by older persons. For example, in 2017, my predecessor issued a report on assistive technology and robotics and its impact on the human rights of older persons. Last year, as part of my report containing an initial assessment of COVID-19 pandemic, I looked at this issue, particularly from the point of view of the right to information. These and other reports articulate the many positive ways digital technologies can be used to assist and support the realization and protection of the human rights of older persons, while at the same time underlining associated risks and persistent barriers to digital inclusion. I would like to briefly outline some of the key elements in this regard, also taking into account the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, the right to information entails that older persons have equal, easy, and practical access to information. This is especially important in emergency situations, including as we are seeing during the COVID-19 pandemic, where much of the information about health and socioeconomic measures is primarily available online. In this context, impediments to access information about COVID-19 and related support services can negatively impact the health of older person and aggravate exclusion or marginalization. In addition, digital technologies play an essential role in being able to participate in political, economic, social, and cultural life. For instance, they can facilitate older persons' participation in decision-making, public consultations, such as through online polls and surveys. With the digitalization of government services advancing in many places, and now coupled with the breakdown of regular communication channels and networks due to lockdowns, physical distancing measures, older persons need to be empowered to use digital technology while also having the possibility and awareness of alternative ways to access public services. This is especially important in cases when older persons are in need of support or help because of abuse or neglect. Digital and assistive technologies have a great potential to increase the ability of older persons to live independently and autonomously, and to fully exercise their human rights on equal basis with others. They could notably bring cost-effective and efficient solutions to the increased demand for care and need for individualized support for older persons. That said, the design and use of such technologies needs to be thoroughly assessed from a human rights perspective, ensuring that the technology does not stigmatize older persons and takes account of their diverse needs and preferences. It is also important to recognize that technology should not be an alternative for human interactions. The use of assistive and smart aging technology by older persons further presents opportunities as well as risks in terms of data collection. As examined in the Mandates 2020 report, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed a flagrant lack of data on older persons to capture their lived realities and the enjoyment of their human rights, which is a prerequisite for informed decision-making and normative action. The digital footprint created through new technologies leads to an exponential increase of available data that creates possibilities for addressing the data gap. However, there are also risks that data collected this way overlooks those less digitally visible, and particularly those in more vulnerable situations. A further challenge are expressions of online ageism as well as abuse and discrimination targeting older persons, which can increase the risk of abuse against them offline. This brings the question of the regulation of user-generated online content. Companies should apply human rights standards at all stages of their operations. For example, rigorous human rights impact assessments for product and policy development, ongoing assessment throughout operations, and meaningful consultations and engagements with civil society and the public, including older persons. As access to and use of digital technologies clearly affect the human rights of older persons, it is imperative to address barriers faced by older persons in terms of digital inclusion and equal access to digital technologies. These barriers can include low digital literacy, unequal connectivity, uneven power relations within households that may deny older persons access to digital devices, language barriers, but also hearing, visual and cognitive impairments and mental conditions such as dementia. The wide range and possible barriers to digital inclusion translated the diversity of older persons themselves. For example, there are surveys suggesting that in some countries the use of digital technology by older persons increased during the global pandemic. At the same time, older persons in the least developed countries or in emergency situations may face exacerbated technological challenges. Differences between urban and rural areas are another factor, as is socioeconomic background and poverty. In this respect, older women may face particular challenges in taking advantage of digital technologies. Generally speaking, there is a need to build digital skills and capacity of older persons, as well as formal and informal caregivers to engage with digital technologies, including assistive products, while understanding and being able to evaluate the benefits and risks of technology. Learning programs and alternative ways of reaching older persons with no digital skills need to be developed. Older persons from low socioeconomic and educational backgrounds and of higher age should be taken into account during the development of the curricula of lifelong learning programs. In parallel, efforts also need to be made with respect to infrastructure, equipment, and connectivity required to the access to internet, especially at times of crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Given the importance of digital inclusion to ensure equal rights and maintain people's autonomy and self-determination in older age, more also needs to be done in terms of international normative frameworks and guidelines, as there is little existence reference to digital inclusion of older persons. For instance, the 2018 Resolution 38/7 on the promotion, protection, and enjoyment of human rights on the Internet of the Human Rights Council calls upon states to bridge the digital divides and to enhance the use of information and communications technology in order to promote the full enjoyment of human rights for all, but does not specifically refer to older persons. Nevertheless, it is encouraging that some initiatives do specifically address the importance of digital technology for the human rights of older persons. For example, the UN Secretary General's policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on older persons, the uneven access to digital technologies, including for older persons, has also been noted in the 2020 report of the Secretary General on the roadmap for digital cooperation. Moreover, the declaration adopted during the 2018 Vienna International Experts Conference on the Human Rights of Older Persons emphasized that all older persons have the rights to enjoy the benefits of developments in technologies and that they must be involved in the design, provisions, and monitoring of the use of technologies. To sum up, being able to benefit from digital technologies, including digital assistive technologies, has wide-ranging human rights implications for older persons. As a tool to access important information about health and safety measures, a means for social, economic, and political engagement and inclusion, as well as providing support to maintain and strengthen capabilities in aging and enable to live autonomous, independent, and dignified lives. This does not come without challenges, notably in terms of privacy, data collection, equal access, and freedom from abuse and discrimination. States, private businesses, civil society, international organizations, and other stakeholders all have a role to play in making sure the benefits of digital technologies are accessible to older persons in their diversity. For example, those living in rural or remote areas, older persons with disabilities, or belonging to indigenous, minority, or migrant communities, and speaking different languages. I look forward to the ensuing panel discussion to hear and learn about what works and how we can move forward from the perspective of different stakeholders. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Claudia, for your remarks. We now move to the stakeholder discussion part of our program. Our moderator today is Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevEx. Our panelists include the Deputy Permanent Representative for the Mission of Mexico, His Excellency Juan Sandoval Mendolia, Alison Bryant, Senior Vice President, Research, Enterprise Lead, Technology, Digital Equity, AARP, Tamea Suto, Knowledge Manager, Innovations for All, BASIS, International Chamber of Commerce. Over to you, Raj.
Thank you so much, Erica. And it's so nice to be with all of you. I remember this has become an annual tradition now. This is the 14th annual version of this event that AARP puts on with its colleagues and partners at the UN. And I have been honored to be a part of it for the last few years. And I'm remembering the warmth in the room when this happens in New York in the Secretariat. I know it's not the same to do it virtually, but it really is lovely to be with all of you and to talk about such an important issue once again. I'm glad that you've reconvened, even though we have to do it in this virtual format. I just think back, we're now about a year into COVID becoming a global pandemic. And I think back to the beginning of this. And if you all remember, there was an idea that kind of hatched at the time, which was, well, this is a true pandemic. It's hitting every country almost at the same time all over the world. It's a great equalizer, right? We're all experiencing the same thing. And very quickly, we realized that that was a lie, that was wrong, that it was quite the opposite of that, right? And we started to see the tremendous inequalities that already existed in our society across many different lines, just becoming much more apparent, much more visible to us. And that's still the case a year into this. And I think, I don't know what others think, I think that, as we get past this pandemic, we will look back and see this as a moment in time. There'll be the kind of pre-COVID era and the post-COVID era when this realization about the inequities in our societies is just so much more stark for all of us. And it forces us to really answer deeper questions about what are we doing about these great inequalities in our society. And so I'm so pleased that we're digging into what I think is one of the important ones today. And I just want to begin with our panelists with kind of a high level general question about that, about how you see the importance of this issue, why it mattered in the sea of other issues that you're focused on. Maybe I can begin with you, Ambassador Sandoval. You're working on a sea of issues there in your mission. Why this one of digital inclusion of older people actually should be something we care about and focus on as we get past the COVID era?
Thank you very much, Raj, and very good morning to all the participants and the audience. I would like to thank, first of all, the organizers for the opportunity of participating in this briefing series and share some thoughts with all of you. As you just mentioned, and it has been said this morning, digital technologies play a central role in almost every facet of our lives, also of older people, of course. The impact of digital technologies on older persons is no exception about this. Perhaps the most obvious example right now is the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, where digital technologies offer both opportunities and challenges for older persons. At this moment, many older persons are struggling with websites to get in the list to get their COVID-19 vaccines. You will see how children, grandchildren, older persons, neighbors, friends are helping them to get into the lists.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Ambassador, but this idea of registering for a vaccine, which is life or death, right?
Yes,
it's very critical.
As important
it's really
as that.
Highlighting this issue more than anything else, I think, in the past year.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost a cruel example, and how we shouldn't let them behind. It's essential to make actions, to act fast. It's something that we are living today, and we really need action on this. Physical distancing has become the norm to prevent the spread of the virus. However, this can be harmful for older persons who usually already experience some levels of loneliness. While the use of digital platforms has reason to continue communicating with relatives and friends, older persons usually lack access to the skills necessary to use the platforms. So especially in developing countries, I cannot tell you, what is otherwise seen as an enabler of equality becomes a factor that exacerbates the problems to older persons. For the population over, I would say, 50 or 60 years, the use of internet platforms, digital devices, and e-commerce is significantly lower in comparison to that of other age groups. More often, that not all the older persons are excluded to the lack of digital skills, but sometimes they are excluded from work. Their inability to properly handle digital technologies prevents them from entering the labor market or obtaining better job opportunities. Also related to the lack of digital skills of many older persons is the likeliness of being victims of misinformation or even scams. They don't believe that it could be people so mean for having or generating the fake news or all this information. When older persons are online, through social media, many times they have a misconception of the functioning of these networks and tend to believe or share whatever they read. I'm sure that we have many examples in our families. And so
Well,
they
a lot of these
really,
scams are, these are major organized groups that are scamming older people too, right? It's not just picking people on kind of one-off basis. This is sometimes a very organized approach. Go ahead, Ambassador. Please finish your thought.
Well, I was about to end. No, and that was just underscoring that all these situations are much more in the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are living in a very particular moment. So we really have to pay attention to older persons more than ever. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Allison, maybe I can just turn to you on the same general topic. The ambassador helped illuminate a few of the key points here about why this matters so much now. But what else do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I think the ambassador hit a lot of the highlights. Absolutely. I think that what we've been seeing since the pandemic started is certainly an increase in issues around social isolation for older adults. And that's really across contexts. You have it from, long-term care facilities, certainly in hospitals, but then also things just families, right? Grandparents who are not able to see their grandkids and normally are able to. So we're definitely seeing more feelings of loneliness or social isolation in older adults. And we know that has health impacts in the long term. So that's certainly a critical piece. Of course, we've seen a lot of issues around health and telehealth and access. And so again, within hospitals, but also in homes. So that's been a critical piece. We've also seen all of the issues that have happened in long-term care facilities and what the lack of technology access has had there. I think we're also seeing it in areas like employment and for small businesses and big businesses. So we've seen issues with older adults being sort of the first fired and the last hired in some of these. And some of that is around ageism, around perceptions of how they engage with technology that we know are not necessarily true or that need to be a piece of infrastructure in organizations, right? And part of the either upskilling or reskilling and training. So I think all of those things we've seen. I think the other piece of this, and we've been doing quite a bit of research on this with consumers, at least in the US, is we have an expectation from consumers, and particularly older consumers, that a lot of these changes that we're seeing and a lot of the need for technology and the use of technology is going to continue. So when everyone, we get everybody vaccinated, there's not an expectation that this is going to suddenly go away, right? We're going to see telehealth continue to be something that's going to become more normative. And that's a good thing, right? So that people can have access to healthcare and not necessarily have to go in. Although we do have to address how do we make sure we're dealing with social isolation issues, because for some lonely adults, going in and actually engaging with a medical provider is one of the ways that they socially interact. So I think we're going to see that. We're going to continue to see it in general for social connections, right? We're hearing grandparents, for example, say, you know what, having to video chat with my grandkids has actually been great. That's something I want to continue to do once I am able to see them in person again. So a lot of these things are not just about the pandemic. I think this has been a pivot and an inflection point. And honestly, I'm glad we're finally addressing these issues. I think a lot of us have been talking about these for a long time. They've sort of come into the center, right? This idea that digital inclusion is foundational for social and societal equity, I think has been brought to light in the pandemic.
Also, I think that's a great jumping off point to bring Timay into the conversation, because Timay, you're thinking at the International Chamber of Commerce about how the private sector fits into this. And you could easily see how technology companies say, well, we're racing to launch the most innovative new platform that completely disrupts a new sector and industry. And this sounds nice, but this sounds like something we need to do later. You're thinking in a different way, right? You're trying to find ways to address these social issues directly with the rollout of new technologies. As a knowledge manager, they're thinking about an information society we're building together. How are you thinking about this, and what's the role of the private sector?
Thank you, Raj. Before I answer a question, just quickly to introduce my organization. Thank you very much for having me on the panel. I'm joining you from the International Chamber of Commerce. And ICC, is the world's largest and most representative business organization. We have around 45 million companies in our network from all sectors, from across more than 100 countries in all regions of the world. And that includes SMEs to the biggest companies and brand names that you can think of, and also chambers of commerce and associations. So ICC's mission really is to make business work for everyone, everywhere, every day. And we are painfully aware of the fact that we cannot fulfill that mission if the people that we are working with are not connected and not able to reach the services or not equipped to use the latest technologies. So for years, business has advocated for the potential of digital technologies to act as sort of catalysts for accelerated implementation of shared development goals like the UN SDGs, for example. And Ambassador Sandoval and speakers before have really touched on the fact of how COVID has sort of underlined this idea of how important digital technologies are for us in just keeping lives and livelihoods safe and secure while while the crisis hits, and how technologies can actually help bring and equalize the people. And what we find at the ICC is that the biggest beneficiaries of digitalization and digital technologies are actually the people who, in relative terms, would be the people who are right now left behind or less included. And this includes obviously the elderly, the topic of our conversation today, but also women and girls and migrants and refugees and displaced people and people with disabilities and all the others. So the digital divide is not a novelty. The digital age divide is not a novelty. It became very apparent with the invention of the smartphone, for example. I think we've seen that gap pretty quickly become very visible. But we have been aware of the older generations falling behind the uptake of new technologies and devices compared to younger generation long before that. And what I wanted to point out is a recent study by the Ericsson Consumer Lab that found that the digital divide has been very promisingly narrowing between the younger and older generations just up to 2020, just up to COVID. And this was because the older generations were sort of slowly catching up. This is with the aging of population who was 20 years younger in 2000. So the gap just naturally narrowing, but also because older people recognized and actually wanted to learn, and businesses recognized the importance of including older generations into the technologies that they were developing. So up until 2020, we've been seeing this divide narrowing. From in 2010, it was about 70% divide between the older generations, the ones 60 to 69 year olds, as compared to the average population. In 2020, this narrowed down to less than 20%. But what we're seeing now with COVID is that this.
To me, is that connectivity or that's like digital literacy? How would you describe that gap?
Self-reported use of internet and digital technologies. Ericsson looked into 17 countries, people between 60 and 69 year olds, and how much they use the technology. So it's self-reported usage of technology. But what they have seen in that study is that this narrowing of the gap has started to stop with COVID, and this was not because the older generations used less technology. They actually used more over the past year, as the speakers before showed. But this is because the younger people have increased the use of technology again multifold in comparison to the older generations. And what we see as well is that there is a gap now showing between the older generations themselves. So those who are more able or more willing or just have the means to pick up new technologies quicker than their peers in the same age group. And I think, Alison, you touched on that, and Ms. Muller has touched on that also, is there are differences in the actual older generations group as well, be that geographically, be that in ability, be that in just socioeconomic background. There's a lot to unpack there of why that might be.
Let's pick up on some of those threads today and keep the conversation going. And I do want to mention to those who are following along, we've got a lot of great questions already put into the Q&A. Don't hesitate to put more in. We want to hear your questions and comments, and I'll try to weave them into the discussion as we go. And I think, Timea, you brought in a couple of really key threads here. One is that technology is not sort of the problem. It's also a huge enhancer of so many of the challenges we're trying to address. Technology can be a solution to them, but we have to be thinking of it in a different way if we want to address the disparities that exist in society. And you've also brought up the fact that this isn't such a clean and simple divide where it's just about age, right? There are many other inequalities that are combining here and pushing some people into a more challenging situation than others. Ambassador Sandoval, maybe we can just bring you in to think about a specific case and example of Mexico. And I know that Mexico is part of the Digital Inclusion and Data Roundtable, which is a follow-up to the Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. So maybe you can just give us some tangible ideas of what you're doing in terms of your foreign policy and domestically in Mexico that connects to this issue.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. You know, for Mexico, as for most of the countries, the achievement of the SDG goals and the targets is a top priority. And that includes bridging the global divide, not only in our country, but also as part of our multilateral efforts and actions. We need to have global connectivity by 2030, and we really think that we can do it. That should be one of the major achievements of the pandemic, or one of the major lessons. We need to have universal connectivity by 2030, no matter what. That must be a real goal for everybody. Mexico, in the case as you just mentioned, has developed a paradigm shift to prioritize inclusion, digital transformation, and the promotion of the development of new models, methods, and training programs to fight the digital inclusion divide. In 2019, we launched the program Internet for All, which aims at realizing the integration of people to internet technology and mobile telephone service all over the country, promoting the inclusion of all sectors of the population, including, of course, older persons, and ensuring the direct delivery of all social welfare programs to the users. Additionally, the National Institute for Older Persons in Mexico offers computer and internet training nationwide to bring them closer to the new technologies, increasing their chances not only to be able to communicate, but also to enter the labor market and fighting their digital and social exclusion. Under our national policy of social inclusion, the government has developed the digital inclusion centers, which are interconnected spaces that facilitate the development of digital skills and competencies, either in person, virtually, and in a hybrid model. Older persons are also taking advantage of these centers. At the multilateral level, like you said, Mexico is a co-chair of the group of Friends of Digital Technologies, together with Finland and with Singapore. And our main objectives are to analyze interlinkages between technologies and the UN, to examine through a cross-cutting perspective the best mechanisms for cooperation and governance of new technologies, and to continue the learning process in the area and the organization. Together with UN Women, Mexico is also a champion of the group that follows up of the recommendations on digital inclusion of the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation. These recommendations, the ones coming from the roadmap, are key for leaving no one behind. We are focusing on the digital inclusion of persons in vulnerable situations, such as older persons. We are also working on the definition of digital inclusion and digital literacy metrics, including those to measure specific needs of older persons, and the establishment of a multi-stakeholder digital inclusion coalition. But we are at the very beginning of these efforts. I mean, at least we already have identified the needs, but we are really, well, at the beginning of a huge endeavor that we will have to do all together. But so it's very timely. Yeah, it's fantastic. At least having the opportunity of having these meetings like this one, where we can create this conscious, the leaving no one behind implies older persons in the digital era, and just try to remember that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sandoval. And Allison, maybe you can pick up from there. You know, we're getting a number of questions in. People are saying, what are some of the specific proposals to fix these issues? What's the role of the private sector? I know this is something you think about a lot. Some of the examples from Ambassador Sandoval were, you know, government proactively going out and trying to do digital literacy training and creating centers. How much of this is about government creating educational opportunities? How much is about regulatory frameworks to push technology companies and connectivity, internet, telecom companies to expand access? How much is about the kind of consumer business side of this? How do you see all of these pieces fitting together?
Yes, and no, I think that's one of the issues, right? And I want to echo also the feeling that although this has certainly been an issue for a while, it definitely feels like we're in the beginning of a real movement. And I think this is part of why we're excited about having this event today and are hoping to have continued dialogue on this. So the way that AARP both addresses issues like digital equity and other things that we work on is we really think about it as an ecosystem, right? As we try to think about it holistically and address across those issues. So in this particular case, I think we're looking at addressing issues of policy, right? So some of that is around infrastructure, right? Or do people have access to high-speed, low-cost internet, or other kinds of regulatory policies? And again, we're more focused in the US, but I think we're wanting to both learn from other countries as to what they're doing and also talk about what are things that are more global that we could talk about on a policy level. So that's one piece. I think from a consumer perspective, I think that to me, I hit on a really critical point, which is that we have to be clear about who are we talking about, right? So generally speaking for AARP, we tend to talk about the 50 plus, but we know when it comes to technology that that is not sort of that broad stroke doesn't really work, right? And in fact, our data is showing that there's more of a cliff for 70 plus. So if we're going to focus our efforts and resources, we need to be focusing a little bit older. It doesn't mean we leave the others behind, but it means that if we're going to really solve this, we need to be specific about who it is we're trying to address. And is it, an age, is it rural versus urban, or is it a specific context? People who have been in the workforce, and particularly white collar workforce, may have had exposure to technology and may be sort of less behind. So I think that piece of it is important. Certainly digital literacy is something that we are trying to address as a private organization. And that's something that you're going to be seeing a lot more from AARP. We have been doing digital literacy programming, but that is something that we are investing heavily in, that both virtual, right, but also in person. So I think we have an issue on the consumer side of connecting the unconnected, and how do we actually do that? So you have to make sure, for example, that you have, if you're trying to get people online, you have things like phone access to tech support, right? You can't assume that everything is going to be digital. And then I think we have the issue of the industry. And again, that's an area where we are really looking to take a stronger organizing role in that space. And so how do we address the industry from inclusive design? So we have issues of what are the best principles. If you take the amazing work that's been done in the disability sector or the ability sector, and you map age onto that, how do we actually develop design principles and help organizations to understand why they're important to bring into play in the same way that we've seen that happen with things like universal design in housing. We have an issue of the workplace. In fact, technology companies are some of the least age diverse, and it's really hard to move the needle on age inclusiveness in technology when we don't have age diversity in the workplace. That's another area that we're trying to do a lot of work and have an amazing group called the Living, Learning, and Earning Longer Collaborative out of our group led by Jean Axius that is trying to start addressing issues of age diversity in the workplace. And then finally, we have to think about media in general, right? So both the media that consumers are seeing themselves represented in, as well as the media that companies are putting out. So we've done research that shows that, if we look at the images that are being put out by brands, only 5% of those images even include older adults with technology. And the ones that do show those images are typically showing older adults being helped by somebody younger, right? Or sort of looking clueless with technology. So they're not positive portrayals. So we got to change that conversation too. So those are all issues, again, in this sort of ecosystem of solutions. Those are all things that AARP has strategies to address in the coming years. But again, we feel like we're in the beginning here, and we're really looking for partners to dive into this with us.
If you think about it, in some ways, the new technologies in the very last few years have actually allowed for us to narrow this gap, right? Now you can speak directly to your device. You don't even need to know how to type into it, and you can get answers. In many ways, the interfaces have become easier to use. AI is getting better, where if you don't have that call center to answer a call, a human to answer the call, maybe you get your question answered by a bot in a way. So in some senses, technology is helping to narrow the gap. But in others, if you're not in this ecosystem at all, if you don't have access to that device or access to the internet, now you're much further behind than you would have been otherwise, right? And we've got a number of questions that have come in kind of related to points like these. And I see Claudia has put on her camera. One question is coming for her, so maybe we can go to her first, which is about how a human rights-based approach could make a difference to a conversation like this.
Yeah, thank you, Raj, for giving me the floor again, and to thank you all the panelists. I think from my perspective, I would also like to pose this question to the others. If a human rights-based approach, a right to access to the services, to deliver and to be part of the design might make a difference, Also in regard, as we already have heard, the data, we are lacking the data. So it should be part of all the different data collections, that all the persons take part and participate in the development processes of the different things. So I would say, from my perspective, it always is a difference if you have a right to something and can claim it, or if you just ask, would it be nice to include me, or would it be good to see? Or on the other side, as you said very often, Alison, they are consumers, but I don't see that there are much consumer rights in this regard. So I would also pass this question to the other panelists: if a rights-based approach would make a difference also for companies, because we all know that there is a human rights-based approach also for business and human rights. So this would be also interesting for me. Thank you so much for giving me the floor again.
Thank you, Claudia. Does anyone want to pick up on that? Maybe Timea?
Sure, I can try and take a stab at it. Thanks for including me into the conversation again, Raj. So look, I mean, I would want to flip it around a little bit to talk to the incentive of why business needs to address this, right? So it's a really starking statistic, and I think Claudia might have alluded to this, or ASG Harris before. The WHO estimates that by 2050, we will have 2 billion seniors over 60 years of age. So that is 3 times as more as we had in 2000, right? That is a huge consumer group that business needs to consider. It would be bad business sense not to consider the needs of this group, and companies are already doing that. It's a clear incentive for companies to focus their activities on the elderly and from a single social demographic group of consumers. Alison alluded to the fact of how companies made it a principal type of idea to work with people with different abilities, right? And we knew what great technologies came of that, right? From closed captioning to text to speech, to having websites that are accessible to different people with different abilities, to actually include diversity into the design of the technologies from the beginning, right? This can and should happen with the elderly. And I think companies are already on the right track. They are developing, deploying, and investing significantly in technologies that, from smart home technologies that actually aid seniors to preserve their independence and live alone, not to be dependent on somebody else for constant care. Into communication technologies to preserve connection, especially as our families are dispersed all over the world more and more with globalization. Elderly can be in touch with their families because of these technologies. Technologies to provide continued education, entertainment, productivity, so that people who are retired, for example, or are enjoying their second youth, as we say in Hungarian, in my mother tongue, they actually feel that they have a purpose. They can work, they can connect. It's not that they are at the margins of society. There is a role for them. Technology allows that as well. And then, of course, is the improvements in effectiveness and performance that technology brings into the healthcare system and the elderly care system, so that people who are there to care for the elderly actually have the time to really care, not just to treat a patient, but to be there and connect. But you've seen the amazing things through COVID with nurses and doctors of what a real net of safety that provided for the elderly. So companies are investing in all of these technologies, and I think what we need to make sure is that to understand how companies take those investment decisions and incentivize a policy environment that allows them to continue to innovate and improve these technologies. Because the real question is not if companies are doing this, but if companies are reaching everyone. And that is increasingly an investment question. It's a market question. Is this worth for a company to go into a rural region? Are there incentives enough for a company to invest, I don't know, in somewhere where there is not enough return on their investment? Are the policy environments there enabling enough for companies to continue innovating and bringing those technology and those innovative ideas into to everyone. And that is increasingly dependent on international cooperation between countries. And it's increasingly dependent on cooperation between stakeholders, so that companies and governments and civil society, groups like the AARP and the United Nations can actually come together and discuss this like we're doing today, and make sure that we develop those policy environments where the company says, okay, well, now it's worth for me to engage here. I can bring my investment, I can bring my innovation. I think that's the first thing that we need to achieve here.
Yeah, I mean, to me, is making an important and nuanced point here, because this could be a kind of a controversial question, right? Whether governments should take a human rights-based approach and essentially set up a regulatory environment that pushes and forces companies to adopt certain practices. And that has been done in the telecom sector, right? In many places, to ensure that people are connected to a phone network, for example, just because they live in a rural area or they're poor, that they might have access to telephones. So how does that map now into a much more complex area of technology pervading all of our lives in every way, including healthcare, for example, which itself is a human right, right? So if you don't have access to the technology and the technology gives you access to the healthcare, what happens? So I don't know, Allison, I see you nodding on this. Maybe you can help to frame it up yourself. How do you think about this? Sure, it sounds good to incent companies in this direction. There's a huge market, big opportunities. Is that enough? Or do we need to also be putting kind of both the carrot and the stick in terms of a regulatory environment? How are you seeing this at AARP?
Raj, it's like you're in my head. That was what I was just thinking, actually. I mean, I really think that what Claudia mentioned about having a human rights approach, it is critical to have that. And I think it's critical to have that in part because that gives us an underpinning for the sort of ecosystem conversation, right? For bringing industry and government and NGOs all together and also having the more global conversation. So I think we have to have that approach. And to your point, because digital inclusion is so much of an underpinning now of other critical human rights that we have, I think it has to be interplayed in there. But I do think on the commercial side, to me, the way I always think about it is we have to move older adults from being a corporate social responsibility issue, like a CSR thing, to making it an economic decision. And I think that's a little bit of what Tamia was getting to, right? But one of the things that I see with technology is that companies still tend to look at older adults, and this I see this in the ability side too, as a segment, right? I'm going to develop for you. And what we're saying is no, we want you to include older adults as you develop everything else. And I can tell you, my background is in digital technology. I've run user experience for every pretty much major tech company in the world. They are very often stopping even recruiting of participants in user experience research, right? In people in their 40s, maybe in their 50s. So how do we even include older adults in co-creation? And to me, that's it's part of an economic argument. But what we see is that when you look at user experience design and you look at inclusive design, when things are designed with a broader universe of people, the end product is always better for everybody, right? So all these great things like closed caption, which again, was developed because of an ability issue. Now, I know we all use it when we're on social media and we're at work and we're not supposed to be listening to something, right? You know, so it's benefiting everybody else. So how do we make sure, again, that it's a human rights argument, but an economic argument as well? I think if we can't get both of those, we're probably not going to fix the broader ecosystem.
Thanks for that, Allison. I want to go to you, Ambassador Sandoval, and I understand you might need to leave early, so if this has to be your last comment, that's fine. There was a question that came in, or an idea really, about forming a global partnership at the international level to bring together the private sector and other groups to address this issue. Do you see this as something that requires kind of new global architecture? Do we need a new global system? I mean, you're working in a roundtable group at the UN. Or is this best handled kind of at the country by country level? Tamia talked about how so much now is at the area of international cooperation. That's where the issues kind of come to play, since tech companies are from all over the world and their users are from all over the world. How are you thinking about this?
Well, as you just said, I think that the list of needs is a long one. We must not forget that more than half of the world's population remains offline. And among those, many older persons are included. The digital dividends coexist with the digital divides. And that's a major problem for the future, for the way forward, for things that we have to work. Older persons, it is clear, and must enjoy a life of fulfillment, of health, security, and an active participation in the economic, social, cultural, political arenas of their societies. It is imperative that older persons have safe and affordable access to digital technologies with the necessary digital skills, which provides them with enough autonomy and independence and brings them back from social and digital exclusion. And that has a human rights dimension, as it has been mentioned. We are talking about exclusion here. When older persons have access and are skilled in digital technologies, this can be very useful for their particular needs. To really leave no one behind, that is one of the major models of the organization. Leave no older person outside, leave no older person behind. It means to have access to new digital technologies, but they must be very friendly. That, as you just mentioned, that implies new way of looking at that. And I'm very happy of being in this webinar this morning, because these are one of the points we really need to talk about this. We really need to say it, but especially, we need friendly access, but no added costs. And I remember the banks very because I've been son of older persons, and if they don't know how to manage the account online perfectly for their transfers, they have to pay more for going to the bank in person. So those things that are so insensible from the private sector. How is it possible that the banks are charging more older persons because they cannot do the operation fully online? That's a problem. And I think that's everywhere. So we really need to adapt the operating system to increase the size of the menus and to make it more accessible to persons. But I would like only to conclude by saying that digital skills and the access to digital technologies is a very important aspect of the work of the United Nations when we talk about older persons. And we shouldn't forget that taking measures to protect their health, their rights, is the best way forward. And we really need to cover the needs of our aging population. The digital component is going to be one of the ways to accelerate the fulfillment of their rights. And that will be my last word. And I'm very sorry I have to leave because I have to share something else from 3 minutes ago. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. No, we appreciate you being here, and I think you've left us on a great point to continue here. And we have a number of great questions that have come in as well. So let me turn to Allison and Timea if I can, just to pick up from where the ambassador left off. He gave the great example of banking, and the idea that I know there's a restaurant I used to go to back when we went to restaurants, and they had decided to only accept digital payments. You couldn't pay with cash anymore. And it makes great sense in so many ways. It's more efficient for their business. Probably the workers got bigger tips. There were so many good sides to this, yet you could imagine that excluding 5 or 10 or more % of their customer base who they're not connected digitally. They don't have that credit card or debit card, or they're not comfortable using it in that environment. And, I wonder how you think about this transition period, because we're talking about very large groups of people who could be left behind or could be forced to pay more. And one of our people who's joined us, our attendees, has asked, how do we maybe get policy and private companies to provide better service centers for customers, to simplify issue resolution? And you could see that would make a lot of sense, where you could have a phone call, a place you can call and reach a person who helps you with some tech issue you have. But of course, all those things have costs associated with them. So how do we balance these issues? Allison or Timea, whichever one of you wants to jump in first. Or if neither is jumping in, maybe I can ask.
I was giving Timea a chance, because I know she certainly works with a lot of folks. I'll make a quick comment and then I can turn it over to her. I actually don't think this is a short-term issue, Raj. I think, this is not like this is just going to be in this moment where we're going to there's always going to be a 5 or 10% until we really move the needle on all these sort of critical issues, right? So I think the restaurant one's a really interesting one. And I think it's interesting too, because we've seen this, and we work with a lot of startups at AARP, and we have seen a lot of startup companies doing some interesting solutions to this. So I'm thinking, for example, the issue of of Uber and Lyft and shared ride services, right? That's another great example of, you think of older adults could be huge beneficiaries of that. Maybe also we'll talk in a post-COVID world here too, but there are often issues of them getting connected to that. So there's some really interesting startups that came along that were able to solve some of that, right? They either created phone access to an online digital app service or something else. So how do we facilitate potentially, sort of rapid development in this ecosystem with startups? And those could be, government funded, or could be, there's a whole range of ways to do that through government mandates, but also I think in the private sector and looking at things like acquisition by larger companies. So I do think there's a way for us to do this quickly. But again, we got a long haul here. I don't think this is a short-term problem.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Alison hit the nail on the head there. A couple of things. So I think one of the major things that Alison said, and I wholeheartedly agree, that you need to balance the progress and then sort of the transition period. Because if you have no incentives, if you don't have a restaurant that says, I'm not accepting cash anymore, what is the incentive to start using the digital, which is more convenient or easier for tax purposes, for example, or any other reason, right? So you need that drive, you need that innovation, you need that puller effect to drive these things go forward. Now what the issue is, of course, as Alison said, is not to leave anyone behind while you're having that, not to leapfrog over a generation, not to leapfrog over a set of skills. And I think there, what the key is cooperation, right? Because it's openness to the input of the other stakeholders, not necessarily the other age groups, but also to work with civil society organizations, for companies to be able to work with governments to be able to work with companies, to share the knowledge, to share the approaches, and to co-design the system in which we respond to this, right? So I think the key is this involving all the stakeholders into the policy-making process, into the design of new technologies, and into the design of the policies that enable new technologies.
That inclusion at every step is the key theme I'm seeing from both of you. Claudia, you wanted to jump in as well. Please do so.
Thank you for giving me the floor again. I just want to see it a little bit from the other side of the coin. What you are describing is a discriminatory approach in a way. So we also need to find ways how to support and assist. And you already mentioned it would be good in collaboration. But if we really have a human rights-based approach, we would really act on the inclusion of the older persons and try to find a solution which is on a non-discriminatory basis and give equal access to older persons as well. So if they need support with the devices in a way, or to get the debit card, and it's not only to get the debit card, there are many different other things. So we should also think about support, how it's easier for them to get access to the tools. As we already said, it's not only the devices, there are many different things, so they can really enjoy their human rights. Thank you.
Yeah, Claudia is making the point that there's two ways to look at this, right? We're going to address a challenge in society, a gap and inequity, by creating a separate path for people, or are we developing a system that is truly inclusive from the beginning for everyone, right? That's a very different way of looking at it. And it seems like if you think about technology and how it's developed today, it's largely young startup companies picking a particular market and chasing it. And that means there's probably a lot of groups that are not included in that initial market that they're focused on. In a way, it's quite opposite of the approach that you're taking. I wonder, though, if we don't have that person here, but if we had that technology startup, if they would say, hey, there's no way to do it that way. We have to be narrowly focused on our core market, which might be San Francisco taxi drivers or something in the case of Uber. How do you think of it, Alison? You've spent a lot of time working with these technology firms.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is something, again, that we're working on at AARP, I think part of it is, you're right. I mean, there is something about the startup ecosystem, and they do need to be focused so that they can actually develop product and whatever. I think we try to think of this as how do we convince more startups to then focus on this market, right? We know it's huge, right? By 2030, we're looking at older adults spending $84 billion on technology, right? Anyway, so this is a big market. So how do we get startups and those folks to focus on it? And then I think the flip of it is, even when they're not necessarily focused on it, how do we convince, cajole, there could be a lot of carrots and sticks here, to think about that market when they go into their second phase of development, right? Because that's just the startup piece. There's always the next phase, right? There's almost always an expansion of audience in some way. So how do we do it in that second sector if it's not in the first? So I think that's an interesting thing. But I also hear a lot from startups especially, but even from bigger companies, questions of, well, great, but we need resources to do that. Can you help us to access older adults, right? I mean, that's a lot of the questions we get at AARP. So even those that are interested don't necessarily have that as a resource. So I think we need to think about that as well.
We just have a couple of minutes left. Tamaya, do you have a final thought or two?
Sure. Really quickly. I think the 3 layers that we need to focus on is really making sure that we can make the infrastructure accessible, making sure that we can make the applications and services that we provide on top of that infrastructure accessible and inclusive and relevant. I think relevance is super important in this field. And then the 3rd layer is the skills. We need to invest in the skills to understand the application that I'm using, depending on what my age is, what my ability is. We need to make sure that the users' skills are there to understand and interact with the technology, and then understand it as much as then they can actually build it themselves. So I think those 3 layers are interconnected. We need to be able to act on all those layers, and we need to act on it together. So there is a certain pulling force of a human rights approach. There is a certain chilling effect of overregulation. We all know that as well. We need to be able to work together to find the right balance of when we need to incentivize through regulation, and then when we need to incentivize through market effects.
And I'll just add to your 3 layers there, kind of an overarching one, which is making sure older people are visible in these conversations, which is why this event is so important. And it's something that we talked about every year that this event happens, because a feature, a systemic problem in our world is that there are people who are marginalized, and often the sense is, well, older people shouldn't be in this conversation, or they're victims. They don't have the ability, and there's a stereotype that, well, they shouldn't be. How would you connect them to a technology question? And so just breaking down some of those mindsets and really saying right from the beginning, as Allison said, this is an issue of rights and inclusion, and everyone belongs at this table, does change hopefully the way we address these problems, and maybe gives us a new normal, as we've all been saying after this COVID pandemic, that actually is inclusive of everyone in society. So thank you for an inspiring session, everyone. I really appreciate your comments. Thanks for all the questions and great comments from attendees in the chat. Really appreciate that. And I know we are now concluding this panel and moving on. So I think I pass it on to Erica. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj, for your brilliant and artful moderation, as always, and to our panelists for their truly insightful and timely remarks and conversation. I'd like to now call on the Deputy Secretary General of the International Telecommunications Unit, Malcolm Johnson, to provide concluding remarks. Over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon. Good evening. Let me start by thanking our moderator and the speakers for tremendously interesting presentations on how digital technologies can help older persons, especially during this terrible time we're living through with the pandemic. ITU, of course, is very, very pleased to collaborate with AARP and DESA on this event. It's very, very timely, more so than ever before. It's important now for older persons to be able to connect and use ICTs effectively, not just for their health and welfare, but to be able to order and purchase items online, keep in touch with family, friends, keep up to date with the latest information and advice, and generally to overcome the feeling of being isolated. From our side in ITU, together with the other UN organizations and stakeholders involved in the World Summit on Information Society Forum, which we run every year, we've started a special track on old persons and ICTs. And this addresses several of the challenges that we've talked about at this event, from age-based discrimination in the workplace to achieving healthier aging and ensuring financial inclusion of older persons. And this is helping to create an awareness, exchange of best practices, and bring together many beneficial partnerships. So this year's WSIS Forum is currently ongoing. We're looking to build on this success. We have a special WSIS prize on ICTs for older persons, and we're organizing a hackathon on ICTs and older persons in collaboration with the Global Coalition on Aging. The WSIS Forum is open to everyone, so I very much hope you'll all join us for that. The details can be found on the WSIS Forum homepage. So one benefit of the pandemic, of course, is that it has accelerated digital transformation and has raised the awareness of the importance of ICTs to achieve progress towards the SDGs. But for that, of course, we need to have everyone online. That's the mission of ITU. And currently, of course, we have around 3.7 billion people still unconnected. And these are mostly in the developing countries and those living in the rural areas, where the return on investment, of course, is so much less than the urban areas. So connecting everyone is very, very important. I mean, we must incentivize governments and the private sector to invest in these areas. Then ITU is gathering the statistics on the use of ICTs on a geographic basis, also distinguishing between young and old and men and women. So these statistics are very important for policy makers to help progress the infrastructure, the literacy, affordability, and the quality and reliability of access. And as has been mentioned, digital skills are really critical. And this is more challenging, of course, for older persons than for the younger generations. And the pandemic has underlined the critical importance of having these skills to navigate these virtual times and to thrive online. As has been mentioned, the difficulties experienced by older persons in securing their vaccine appointments is one critical area. So providing training online is very important, and this is what we're doing in ITU in collaboration with a number of other organizations. And also, as we've heard, tackling this big challenge will require a number of innovative approaches. So this is the key point I would like to make, is that we all need to work together. Collaboration is the key word. We must bring everyone online, regardless of age, gender, location, financial means, or their skills. In a world that is aging rapidly, I'd just like to again reconfirm ITU's commitment to work together with all stakeholders, all our organizations, to help bring older persons online and empower them to make the best use of the digital technologies so that they can take their rightful place in the global community. So thanks again to all the speakers. Thank you to the organizers. We look forward to continuing our collaboration with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, DSG Johnson, and we are thrilled to hear of your continued collaboration, the International Telecommunications Union, on this issue of older persons and technology. I'd like to thank all our participants, our speakers, our moderator, for being with us today, and I urge you to join us for our future events on this topic, and wishing everybody a very productive CSocD59. Thank you again.